Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
So, I want you to just imagine for a second that you have a magical ability.
Okay, like a superpower.
Yeah, exactly. With just a simple snap of your fingers, you can instantly and completely untraceably insert your name into the wills of the richest people on Earth.
Oh, wow. So just snap and I'm a billionaire.
Right. Nobody will ever know. You will never, ever be caught. The law will completely protect you. Do you snap your fingers?
That is such a wild temptation to throw out there.
It really is.
And today, we are diving deep into that exact temptation. We are going to extract the practical wisdom and the core moral insights from Book 3 of Marcus Atilius Cicero's masterful work, De Officiis, or On Duties.
It's just a remarkable text. And to truly grasp the weight of that question about the snapping fingers, you kind of have to understand the world the author was living in.
Right, because this wasn't exactly a calm period in history.
Not at all. Cicero is writing this in the dying days of the Roman Republic. I mean, the world as he knew it was basically falling apart.
It was politically chaotic, right? Sliding completely into authoritarianism and civil war.
Exactly. And in the midst of this profound, terrifying instability, Cicero is writing a philosophical letter to his son, Marcus.
Who is off studying abroad in Athens at the time.
Right. He's far away from the chaos. And it paints this incredible picture of a father trying to impart a moral compass to his kid, right as the world seems to have completely lost its mind.
And he doesn't start with easy questions either. No. He tackles what might be, honestly, the single most difficult tension in human ethics.
Yeah, the classic conflict.
Exactly. What happens when doing the right thing directly conflicts with what is advantageous to you?
Which is something we've all faced.
Oh, absolutely. We've all been there. You have a choice in front of you. One path is morally right, but it's going to cost you, money or status or maybe your career trajectory.
Right. And the other path, it gets you the promotion, it secures the bag, or wins you the election.
But it requires you to bend your morals.
And Cicero's answer to this is just uncompromising. It is going to challenge you deeply, especially in our modern culture.
Because he argues that this conflict between what is right and what is advantageous is entirely an illusion, right?
Yes. He says expediency, meaning what is truly advantageous for you, and moral rectitude are actually the exact same thing.
They only appear to conflict.
Exactly. If something is morally wrong, it cannot, by definition, be expedient or advantageous to you in the long run.
See, on the surface, that sounds like a lovely sentiment. It sounds like something you embroider on a pillow.
A nice little motivational poster.
Yeah. But the genius of Cicero is that he doesn't just leave it in the realm of high-minded philosophy.
No, he drags it right down into the mud.
He drags this idea down into everyday life. He looks at Roman law, commerce, and real estate, and he asks, where does deception actually begin?
He sets up this fascinating contrast between civil law and what he calls universal or moral law.
The civil law being the actual written rules of society.
Right. The civil law, he notes, is incredibly limited. It only deals with sharp practices as far as it can lay its strong arm upon them.
Meaning the law only punishes what it can catch.
Exactly. And what it has explicitly defined as illegal in a courtroom.
But the moral law, the universal law, is governed by reason and conscience.
Yes. And reason demands that nothing be done with unfairness, with false pretense, or with misrepresentation.
Cicero uses this brilliant analogy that I really want to back up. He compares deceptive business practices to setting a snare for wild creatures in the woods.
That is such a vivid image.
Right. He says, look, even if you don't actively chase the animal into the trap, is it not deception to just set the snare?
Because wild creatures often fall into traps completely on their own.
Exactly. It's a perfect metaphor for passive deception.
And he applies this directly to real estate, which is so funny to read in an ancient text.
He really does.
He asks, is it morally permissible to post a deceptive to be sold sign on a house, like a snare, and just wait for some unsuspecting buyer to wander into it?
Right, because the civil law might not explicitly forbid you from hyping up a terrible piece of property.
Yeah, you could completely hide its structural flaws, and maybe it's technically legal.
But the moral law absolutely forbids it, because you are setting a trap.
And Cicero actually calls the civil law a mere outline sketch of true law and genuine justice. It's not a full lifelike image.
I really want to build on this snare analogy because that outline sketch of the law sounds exactly like modern terms of service agreements.
Oh, totally. That is the perfect modern parallel.
You know the experience. You download an app or sign up for a service, and you were presented with 50 pages of dense legalese.
And you just click agree because you're tired.
Right. Now, that is legally binding. It fits perfectly inside the outline sketch of civil law. But are those terms morally right?
I mean, usually not. They are often explicitly designed to be unreadable.
They're designed to exploit our exhaustion and our ignorance so the company can harvest our data in ways we just don't understand.
I think Cicero would look at a modern terms of service agreement and call it exactly what it is. It's a snare.
Yes. Setting a snare in the ancient woods is exactly like burying a predatory data harvesting clause on page 42 of a user agreement.
You aren't forcing the user to click agree with a sword to their throat, sure.
But you are setting a trap, relying on their fatigue to lead them into it.
So, if the civil law allows us to exploit someone's ignorance, if it's perfectly legal to bury that clause, why does Cicero argue that nature itself forbids it?
Yeah, what is the actual harm?
The harm is existential. Cicero argues that there is a universal bond of fellowship that unites all of humanity together.
And when you take advantage of someone's ignorance, you break that bond.
Exactly. When you use a loophole to exploit them, you are actively severing that bond of human fellowship. You are acting against human nature itself.
He has this incredibly powerful line in there. He says, "No greater curse in life can be found than knavery that wears the mask of wisdom."
Knavery that wears the mask of wisdom. That hits so hard.
It really does. It perfectly describes the person who thinks they're being savvy or a shark in business.
When really they are just a common deceiver.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Trickery desperately desires to pass for wisdom.
The trickster says, hey, look how clever I am. I found a loophole. I maximized my quarterly profit.
But the function of true wisdom is to discriminate between good and evil.
Right. Trickery prefers evil to good for the sake of profit, and therefore it is the furthest possible thing from wisdom.
He brings up the aediles to prove this point, which I found fascinating.
Yeah, the aediles were essentially the Roman market regulators.
And their ruling on the public slave markets was that vendors had to explicitly disclose if a person they were selling was a runaway or a thief.
You couldn't just stay quiet, take the buyer's money, and plead ignorance.
Though interestingly, Cicero notes there was an exception for someone who had just inherited the enslaved person.
Right, because they couldn't possibly be expected to know the history yet.
But for the professional vendor, hiding the truth was strictly disallowed.
It all comes down to this core concept called good faith. He quotes Quintus Scaevola on this.
Scaevola was a Pontifex Maximus, right?
Yes, the highest-ranking priest in Rome. And he attached massive importance to good faith in all arbitrations.
Scaevola argued that good faith had to be the absolute standard in trusteeships, partnerships, buying, selling, renting.
Basically, all the mundane transactions that hold daily society together.
So if we bring this into your life today, this fundamentally challenges so much of modern corporate culture.
Oh, it shakes it to its core. It challenges aggressive sales tactics where you obscure the true cost of a loan, for example.
It challenges the entire buyer beware mentality. Cicero is essentially saying, no, it's not buyer beware, it is seller, be honest.
Yeah, if you know your used car has a faulty transmission and you sell it to a single mother without telling her, you haven't made a savvy business deal.
You have severed the bond of human fellowship. You have degraded your own character.
Even if the law never catches you.
So it forces you to ask, how often are you relying on the outline sketch of what is technically allowed rather than the true image of what is morally right?
That is the mirror he holds up to us. And, it's a pretty uncomfortable reflection.
Definitely. But we have to push further here. Because if we can agree that tricking someone in a standard contract or a used car sale is wrong, what happens when the stakes are exponentially higher?
When we aren't just talking about a minor transaction, but vast generational fortunes.
Right, because that level of temptation changes people.
Which brings us back to that magical snap of the fingers we talked about at the beginning.
We are moving from petty snares to the problem of extreme temptation.
Cicero says, look, we aren't talking about common cutthroats and street thieves here. The law deals with them.
We are studying the conduct of men who have the reputation of being honest.
And he brings up this incredible historical case involving the forged will of a wealthy Roman named Lucius Minucius Basileus.
It's a fascinating historical scandal. Tell us what happened.
So some individuals bring this forged will over from Greece to Rome, and to make sure the forgery goes through probate smoothly, they basically bribe two of the most powerful and respected men in Rome at the time.
Marcus Crassus and Quintus Hortensius.
Exactly. They make these two giants joint heirs in the forged will alongside themselves.
Just to give some context for the listener, Marcus Crassus was famously the wealthiest man in Rome. He was an absolute political titan.
And Hortensius was one of the greatest orators of the age. I mean, these were not street criminals.
Right, and the crucial detail Cicero focuses on is that Crassus and Hortensius suspected the will was a forgery.
They weren't idiots. They knew something was up.
But because they didn't forge it themselves, because they felt no personal guilt in the actual creation of the lie, they happily accepted the inheritance.
Meanwhile, the true heir, a man named Marcus Atilius, who was the nephew of Basileus, was left with absolutely nothing except his uncle's name.
Crassus and Hortensius just took the estate, shrugged their shoulders, and walked away rich.
And Cicero is utterly disgusted by this. He points out that if a man does wrong by simply not defending someone from an injury, how much worse is it to actually aid and abet the injury just to get rich?
Plausible deniability is not a moral defense.
No, it's not. And this leads Cicero to that famous thought experiment we opened with.
It's very similar to Plato's ring of gauges, right?
Yeah.
Where a man finds a ring that turns him invisible.
Yeah, exactly. Cicero calls it the snap of the fingers test. He asks, suppose a good man had such power that with a mere snap of his fingers, he could magically insert his name into the wills of rich men.
Would he do it? Even if he knew with absolute certainty that no one would ever suspect him.
And Cicero says if you offered that power to Marcus Crassus, he would literally dance in the forum.
He'd be thrilled. He'd be snapping constantly.
He really would. But a truly righteous man, a good man, wouldn't do it. He wouldn't rob anyone to enrich himself, even if he could get away with it perfectly.
Which really forces us to define what a good man actually is in this framework.
Cicero gives a very clear definition. A good man is one who helps all whom he can and harms nobody unless provoked by wrong.
Therefore, displacing real heirs with a magic spell or a snap of the fingers is inherently doing harm.
He also tells a great story about a judge named Fimbria to show how seriously the Romans took this label of a good man.
Right. There's a case where a man named Pinthia laid a wager, and the wager was to be forfeited if he could not prove in court that he was, quote, a good man.
And Fimbria, the judge, just flat out refused to render a decision.
Why did he refuse?
Because he said the bar for being a good man is so incredibly high. It requires the performance of countless daily duties and praiseworthy qualities over an entire lifetime.
He couldn't possibly legally declare someone had met it based on a single trial.
Right. Nor did he want to rob a reputable man of his good name by officially ruling against him.
It wasn't just about not breaking the law. It was an active daily pursuit of virtue.
Cicero references a peasant proverb from the time that I absolutely love.
Oh, I know the one. When praising someone's absolute honor and honesty, the peasants would say, he is a man with whom you can safely play at odd and even in the dark.
Odd, and even being a really simple guessing game, usually played with coins or pebbles hidden in the hand.
Right. So if you're playing it in the pitch black, it relies entirely on the honor system.
Because the other person could easily cheat. They could change the number of pebbles, and you'd never know.
So a person you can play that with in the dark is someone of unimpeachable integrity.
Exactly.
But, here is where I kind of have to push back on Cicero, and I think a lot of people listening might feel the exact same way.
Okay, let's hear it.
Isn't Cicero being incredibly naive here? Like, is he actually expecting us to believe that human beings are capable of turning down untraceable, limitless wealth?
It's a big ask.
Look at Crassus. Crassus didn't forge the will. He just benefited from a system that handed him money. In today's corporate world, if an accounting error falls in your favor or a regulatory blind spot gives your company a massive advantage, is it really realistic to expect someone to say, no, thank you, that's not morally pure?
I mean, probably not for most people.
Isn't his definition of a good man utterly detached from biological and economic reality?
I think that pushback is exactly what Cicero anticipated. We live in a world that often explicitly rewards looking the other way.
It really does.
The obstacle we face when reading this is our own cynicism. It is the deeply held modern belief that everyone would snap their fingers if given the chance.
We tell ourselves, hey, if I don't take this advantage, my competitor will.
Exactly. Don't hate the player, hate the game.
Right.
But Cicero argues that the cynicism destroys you from the inside out. Remember his core thesis: what is morally wrong can never be truly advantageous, because human nature itself refuses and resists it.
So if you benefit from a forged will or a predatory business practice, you are acquiring wealth, yes.
But you are losing your status as a good man. You are losing your internal integrity.
And Cicero values that internal harmony far above gold.
To him, the man who cheats in the dark is the ultimate loser, because he has to live with the cheat.
It's the ultimate diagnostic test for your own character. Who in your life can you play odd and even with in the dark?
Who are the people you trust completely, even when no one is watching?
And the much harder question is, are you that person for your colleagues, for your clients, for your family?
If you had the power to magically improve your bank account at someone else's invisible expense, would you dance in the forum like Crassus, or would you walk away?
Because as Cicero points out, money is a powerful lure. But it is not the only lure.
No, it's not. What happens when the temptation shifts from wealth to power?
If a good man can resist the temptation of a stolen fortune, what happens when the currency changes from gold to absolute power over millions of people?
The allure of money is strong, sure, but the intoxicating pull of political ambition, of power and status makes people do much, much worse things.
Which leads us directly into Cicero's examination of the corrosive nature of ambition.
He looks at situations where expediency seems to justify destroying relationships or even destroying entire states just to gain power.
To really understand this, we have to look at the historical examples he provides, like Gaius Marius.
Yeah, Marius is a great example. Marius had been in political obscurity for years. He was serving as a lieutenant under a highly respected general named Quintus Metellus.
And Metellus gives Marius a furlough to go back to Rome for a bit, right?
He does. And what does Marius do at that time? He stands before the Roman people and publicly slanders his own general.
Just throws him completely under the bus.
He accuses Metellus of purposely dragging out the war for his own glory. And Marius promises that if they elect him consul, he'll finish the war immediately.
Now, we need to pause and explain what a consul is, because it's not just a fancy title.
No, it was the absolute pinnacle of Roman ambition.
To be elected consul in the Roman Republic was essentially like being a co-president with supreme military command. It was the ultimate prize.
Precisely. And Marius' slander actually works. He gets elected consul.
But Cicero analyzes the psychology of this act. He says Marius was a traitor to his own good faith.
He threw his boss, an exemplary citizen, under the bus with a completely false charge just to get a promotion.
He gained the consulship, but he poisoned his own soul to do it.
And to see how ugly this gets, you only have to look at another Marius that Cicero mentions, Marius Gratidianus, who was actually a kinsman of Cicero's.
Right. Gratidianus was a praetor. A praetor was a high-ranking magistrate just below a consul, often dealing with the law and courts.
And at this specific time, the currency value in Rome was fluctuating wildly. No one knew what their money was actually worth from day to day.
It was a massive economic crisis, hyperinflation, basically.
So the College of Praetors and the Tribunes drafted a joint resolution to stabilize the currency, and they all agreed to announce it together that afternoon.
It was meant to be a collaborative effort to save the economy.
But Gratidianus pulls a fast one. While the other officials disperse to prepare, he goes straight to the rostra.
The main speaking platform in the center of Rome.
Yes, and he publishes the edict all by himself. He takes sole credit for this hugely popular stabilizing bill.
And the masses absolutely loved him for it, didn't they?
Oh, they erected statues of him in every street. They burned incense to him as if he were a god.
Which brings up a really complex ethical dilemma. Because Gratidianus technically did a good thing for the public.
Stabilizing the currency genuinely helped people.
But he did it through betrayal. He overreached his colleagues to steal the credit. Does the end justify the means?
I mean, I can see a modern politician or a tech CEO arguing, look, the economy's fixed, the product launched, the people are happy. Who cares if Gratidianus stepped on some toes in committee?
But Cicero cares deeply. He says, for all cases, we have one unbreakable rule. What seems expedient must not be morally wrong.
He asks, can we truly account Gratidianus a good man? Does it coincide with the character of a good man to lie, to slander, to overreach, to deceive for profit or glory?
Anything but that.
Oh.
The action itself might have had a positive economic outcome, but the agent of the action corrupted himself.
He takes this all the way up to the highest levels of power, looking at Pompey and Julius Caesar.
Now, we should be clear, Cicero is obviously writing from the perspective of a staunch Republican who absolutely despised dictators.
We're not taking a stance on ancient Roman factions here or trying to map this onto modern politics.
Exactly. But we are looking at how Cicero viewed the psychology of absolute power.
He notes that Pompey allied himself with Caesar just to gain power, failing to see how unjust it was to the framework of the country.
And Caesar, well, Cicero has incredibly strong words for Caesar.
He really does. He says Caesar used to constantly quote a line from a Greek tragedy, the Phoenicia, which essentially translates to, if wrong may ever be right, for a throne's sake it were right to do a wrong, in all else be just.
Basically, you can break all the rules if the prize is ultimate power.
It's the ultimate rationalization of the tyrant.
But Cicero argues that unjust political power, no matter how glorious it looks from the outside, brings only paranoia, fear, and ruin to the psychology of the person holding it.
He quotes a poet, Accius, about the anxieties of kings, pointing out that a man who subjugates his own formerly free people lives a life beset with plots and perils.
Cicero asks this haunting question. What stains are upon his conscience? What scars upon his heart?
This is a profound psychological analysis of ambition. He's saying that ambition, when pursued through immoral means, literally rots you from the inside.
He explicitly asks, what difference does it make whether a man is actually magically transformed into a beast, or whether, keeping the outward appearance of a man, he has the savage nature of a beast within?
It's a terrifying image. Think about the modern equivalents.
The corporate executive who backstabs everyone, destroys careers, and lies to reach the CEO position.
Or the public figure who destroys lives with slander to win an election.
They may wear bespoke suits, they may smile for the cameras, they may have all the trappings of human success, but inwardly, according to Cicero, they have mutated.
They are beasts.
To contrast this inward beastliness, Cicero gives a beautiful historical example of true honor in leadership.
This involves Gaius Fabricius during a brutal war against King Pyrrhus.
Right. Fabricius is approached by a deserter from Pyrrhus's camp, and the deserter offers to go back and secretly poison the king.
It would end the war instantly. It would save thousands of Roman lives. It is the absolute definition of expedient.
But Fabricius and the Roman Senate refused.
They didn't just refuse, they actually handed the deserter back over to Pyrrhus.
They chose to fight the war with the sword, not with poison.
Because, as Cicero points out, if supremacy is sought for glory, crime must be excluded. There is no glory in crime.
You cannot build a just peace on a foundation of assassination and treachery.
And he applies this principle to state finances, too.
Right, with a Roman official named Philippus. Philippus proposed taking away the tax-exempt status of certain allied states.
Even though these states had already paid a massive lump sum to a previous leader, Sulla, for that exact exemption.
So Philippus was basically proposing to double tax them, breaking a solemn treaty.
The Senate agreed because it massively increased revenues.
But Cicero cries out, "Shame upon our government! The pirate's sense of honor is higher than the Senate's."
He even argued against his own friend, the famously strict Cato, saying the treasury shouldn't be so rigorous that it becomes cruel and ungenerous to its allies.
Expediency that relies on breaking faith is just a slow form of state suicide.
Cicero is building an airtight case here. He's establishing a baseline that core principles should never be violated for wealth or power.
But because he is a rigorous philosopher, he realizes he needs to subject his own philosophy to extreme stress tests.
He knows that real life isn't always as clear-cut as refusing to poison a king. Sometimes you are forced to choose between terrible options.
Which brings us to the most intellectually rigorous part of our discussion, the thought experiments of Hecaton.
This is in chapter 23, and it is fascinating because it's basically the ancient Roman equivalent of the trolley problem.
Hecaton was a Stoic philosopher who wrote a book on moral duties. Cicero brings in Hecaton's extreme edge case scenarios to see exactly where morality and expediency intersect or crash into each other.
Let's walk through these dilemmas because they force us to really wrestle with our moral frameworks.
The first one is grim.
Very. Hecaton asked, in a time of severe famine, when provisions are at exorbitant prices, is it consistent with a good man's duty to let his slaves go hungry?
Now we need to pause immediately. This equation of human beings as expendable property is horrifying to us today.
We have to wholly reject the ancient Roman view of human slavery.
Absolutely. But if we strip away the horrific social assumption of the era, we can still engage with the underlying economic and moral stress test Hecaton was trying to run.
He is asking, in a profound crisis of absolute scarcity, how does a leader or a manager calculate survival?
Do you bankrupt yourself and starve your own family to feed everyone equally? Or do you prioritize the core survival of your household unit?
Hecaton argues both sides. He debates the morality of letting people starve versus the expediency of preserving the estate.
He ultimately concludes that it is decided by the standard of duty, leaning toward the practical management of one's household, meaning survival dictates hard, unequal choices.
But the next dilemma pushes this even further.
Right. Hecaton asks, if a ship is sinking in a massive storm and you have to throw cargo overboard to keep the ship afloat, do you sacrifice a high-priced, incredibly valuable horse or a cheap, relatively worthless enslaved person?
Again, the premise is deeply offensive to our modern recognition of human rights. But look at the friction Hecaton is creating.
He says property interest, the purely financial calculation of expediency, inclines one way. The horse is worth vastly more money.
But human feeling, the recognition of shared biology and moral weight, inclines the other way.
I think the reason Cicero includes this is to force the reader to admit that financial value and moral value are not the same thing.
If expediency is truly identical to moral rectitude, you must throw the horse overboard, regardless of the financial ruin it causes you.
Saving the human life is the only moral choice, even in a society that legally viewed that human as property.
Exactly. It's a critique of pure financial calculus. But Hecaton pushes further into conflicts of duty, where the choice is between two equal humans.
Oh, the plank scenario.
Yes. He proposes this scenario. Two wise men are surviving a shipwreck. There is only one small plank floating in the ocean, and it can only hold one of them.
If they both hold on, they both drown. What do?
This one is agonizing. Hecaton says they shouldn't fight over it like animals. One should voluntarily give place to the other.
But how do you choose?
Hecaton says the plank should go to the one whose life is more valuable either to the state or to his own work.
And if they are of exactly equal value?
They should decide by lot or play odd and even and let chance decide.
It's an astonishingly calm, rational approach to an inherently irrational, terrifying situation.
It reminds me exactly of modern triage protocols in hospitals during a mass casualty event or a massive pandemic.
Yes. When resources like ventilators or ICU beds are completely scarce, doctors have to make agonizing calculations.
They can't just operate on first come, first served. They have to decide based on survivability, or sometimes utility.
It's a brutal calculation of expediency, but it's grounded in a moral framework of saving the most life possible. Hecaton is basically doing hospital triage on a wooden plank in the Mediterranean.
He then moves from physical survival to civic survival. What if a father is robbing temples or tunneling into the state treasury? Should his son inform the magistrates?
The tension here is incredible. Familial loyalty versus civic duty. Which one wins?
Hecaton says, no, a son should actually defend his father in court. Loyalty to parents is a foundational pillar of a stable country.
However, there is a line, right?
Yes. If the father attempts to make himself a tyrant or betray the country entirely to an enemy army, meaning his actions threaten the very existence of the state itself, the son's duty shifts.
He must plead with his father, threaten him, and ultimately, if necessary, sacrifice his father to the safety of the country.
The survival of the entire community supersedes the blood tie.
Finally, Hecaton asks some commercial dilemmas that bring us back to everyday life.
If you unknowingly accept counterfeit money and later realize it's fake, can you morally use it to pay a debt to someone else?
Or, if you are selling wine that you know is slowly spoiling, do you have to tell the customers?
He pits two philosophers against each other for this, Diogenes and Antipater.
Diogenes argues for buyer beware. It's the buyer's job to inspect the wine. Antipater argues for absolute full disclosure.
And Cicero, predictably, sides with Antipater and full disclosure. He even asks, if you are selling gold, but the buyer mistakenly thinks it's brass, do you let them buy it for $1 when it's worth 1,000?
An upright man must correct the mistake, even if it costs him a massive profit.
What these dilemmas from Hecaton show us is that while moral rules are absolute, they sometimes bend or conflict under extreme circumstances.
You have to use reason to weigh competing duties, which naturally brings us to a highly controversial question.
If duties can conflict, are there times when it is morally right to break a promise?
We are taught from childhood that breaking a promise is fundamentally wrong. An oath is an oath.
But in chapters 24 and 25, Cicero introduces crucial nuance. He says, look at the dropsy patient.
A man has dropsy, which is a severe swelling disease caused by fluid retention. A doctor gives him a cure, but makes the man promise on his honor to never use the remedy again.
The man is cured. Years later, he gets dropsy again. He asks the doctor for permission to use the medicine, but the doctor cruelly refuses. Should the man break his promise to the doctor?
Cicero says absolutely yes. Break the promise to save your life.
The moral duty to preserve your life outweighs the promise to a cruel doctor.
Then he gives a more absurd, almost comical example to prove the point. A millionaire makes a wise man promise that in order to inherit a fortune of 100 million sesterces, he must dance publicly in broad daylight in the Roman Forum.
The wise man promises, the millionaire dies. Should the wise man dance?
Cicero says it would have been better not to promise such an undignified, ridiculous thing at all.
But having promised, it is morally better to break the promise, refuse to dance, preserve your dignity, and lose the inheritance.
Unless, Cicero adds, the wise man uses that vast fortune to save the state in a grave crisis.
In that case, the moral good of saving the country outweighs the indignity of the dance, and it wouldn't be morally wrong to do a little jig in the town square.
It's a pragmatic loophole, but it's governed by a strict moral calculus.
He backs this up with mythology, pointing out promises that should have been broken.
The sun god promised his son Phaethon whatever he wished. Phaethon wished to drive the sun chariot.
The god knew it was a fatal idea, but kept the promise. Phaethon lost control and was struck by lightning. It would have been better to break the promise.
Or Theseus, who was granted 3 wishes by Neptune. He wished for the death of his son Hippolytus on a false suspicion.
The wish was granted, and Theseus was overwhelmed with grief.
And the most tragic one, Agamemnon vowing to sacrifice the most beautiful creature born that year to the goddess Diana. It turned out to be his own daughter, Iphigenia.
Cicero says he absolutely ought to have broken his vow rather than commit a horrible crime. The keeping of the promise was a greater evil than the breaking of it.
He grounds this in a very practical, chilling example. If a man in his right mind leaves his sword with you for safekeeping, and then later goes violently insane and demands it back, it is your moral duty not to return it.
If someone entrusts money to you but then makes war on your country, you do not return the money.
If we translate this to modern life, it's incredibly relevant. We make commitments all the time that later turn out to be destructive.
Maybe you sign a draconian non-disclosure agreement for a company, and you later discover they are doing something deeply toxic or poisoning a local water supply or committing fraud.
Or maybe you make a vow to keep a friend's secret, but you realize that secret is enabling their severe self-destruction or addiction.
Cicero is giving you moral permission, in fact, a moral mandate, to break that promise.
Because promises are bound by expediency. But we must always remember Cicero's strict definition of expediency.
It means moral rectitude. You break a promise only when keeping it causes a greater moral evil.
You do not break it just because it became inconvenient for you or because it costs you money.
That distinction is everything, but it leads us to the ultimate cliffhanger.
What if keeping a promise doesn't harm others and it doesn't harm the state? What if keeping the promise only brings absolute terrifying ruin to yourself?
Do you still have to keep it?
This brings us to the emotional and philosophical climax of the entire book, the Ballad of Regulus.
This covers chapters 26 through 32, and Cicero dedicates a massive amount of space to it because it is the ultimate proof of his theory.
To set it up, he first dismisses Ulysses. According to the tragedies, Ulysses tried to fake insanity to get out of fighting in the Trojan War.
He just wanted to live a tranquil life at home with his family. Cicero condemns this as cowardly.
He says, avoiding your duty for a quiet life is deeply inexpedient because it degrades your character.
But then we get the true hero, the ultimate counterexample to Ulysses, Marcus Atilius Regulus.
Let's paint the picture of this story in granular detail because it's astounding. It's the First Punic War. Regulus is a Roman consul.
He is captured in Africa by a Spartan general named Xanthippus, who is fighting as a mercenary for Carthage. Regulus is a high-value prisoner of war.
The Carthaginians decide to use him. They send Regulus back to Rome on parole with a specific mission.
He is sworn by a sacred oath to negotiate a prisoner exchange.
If the Roman Senate refuses to hand over the Carthaginian prisoners, Regulus is sworn by his oath to return to Carthage and surrender himself back into captivity.
So Regulus arrives in Rome. You have to imagine the scene. His wife and children are there, weeping, welcoming him home.
He is an ex-consul, a man of massive dignity and respect.
The apparent expediency of the situation is obvious. Convince the Senate to do the exchange, stay home, live out his remaining days in comfort surrounded by his family.
But what does he actually do? He goes to the Senate, but he refuses to even take his seat or cast a vote.
He argues that as long as he is bound by an oath to the enemy, he is technically a prisoner of war and therefore isn't a true member of the Senate anymore.
And then he actively advises the Senate against the prisoner exchange.
He stands up and tells them, do not give the Carthaginians their prisoners back. Those men are young, capable military officers. They will fight you again.
I am just an old man, bowed with age and breaking by captivity. I'm not worth the trade. Keep their men.
His counsel prevails. The Senate listens to him and refuses the exchange.
And then, despite the pleas of his family, the tears of his friends, and the urging of his country, Regulus honors his oath.
He boards a ship and returns to Carthage, fully knowing with absolute certainty that he is going back to a cruel enemy and to exquisite torture.
And indeed, when he arrives, they put him to death by enforced wakefulness. They cut off his eyelids and force him to stare at the sun, torturing him until he dies.
Now I have to step in here and act as the voice of modern pragmatism. Isn't Regulus just a fanatic?
He essentially committed suicide over a technicality. The Carthaginians were the mortal enemy.
How utilitarian calculus, surely the unimaginable pain of his torture outweighs the abstract, invisible value of keeping an oath to a hostile foreign power.
Why didn't he just stay in Rome?
That pushback is exactly what Cicero's philosophical critics argued. And Cicero spends several chapters systematically shooting down those exact counter-arguments.
First, he addresses the Epicureans who said, well, God doesn't get angry, so Regulus didn't need to fear divine wrath for breaking his oath.
Right, if there's no lightning bolt from Jupiter coming for you, why keep the oath?
Cicero replies that an oath isn't about fearing a lightning bolt. An oath is an assurance backed by religious sanctity. It is a pledge to good faith itself.
He quotes the poet Ennius, O gracious good faith, poised upon wings, and thou oath sworn by Jove.
Violating an oath is violating the very fabric of trust that holds humanity together.
Then he attacks the choose the least of evils argument, the idea that the physical pain of torture is a greater evil than the moral wrong of perjury.
This is where we see the profound core of Stoic philosophy. Cicero argues that pain is not the supreme evil.
In fact, some philosophers argue pain isn't an evil at all, it's just a physical sensation.
But moral degradation, the hideousness of a demoralized soul, the shame of being a perjurer and a coward, that is the true supreme evil.
This is the psychology of the martyr. Regulus proved that physical pain cannot destroy a good man. His body was broken, but his character was completely intact.
Therefore, Cicero argues, even while being tortured to death, Regulus was better off, more successful, and happier in a profound philosophical sense than if he had stayed in Rome as a safe, comfortable, perjured coward.
There's also the argument about whether extorted oaths even count. People said Carthaginians forced him to swear under duress, so it doesn't count.
Cicero says you can't bring force to bear upon a truly brave man. He willingly took the oath.
He distinguishes between pirates, who operate completely outside of the law and to whom oaths don't apply, and a legitimate declared enemy, like Carthage, with whom Rome had a official code.
Laws of war that must be mutually respected, otherwise all of civilization breaks down.
Cicero contrasts Regulus's absolute integrity with the prisoners taken at the Battle of Cannae years later by Hannibal.
10 Romans were sent to the Senate on parole to negotiate ransom, sworn to return if they failed.
One of them tried a clever trick. Shortly after leaving Hannibal's camp, he ran back pretending he forgot something.
Then he went to Rome, and when the Senate refused the ransom, he claimed he had technically returned to the camp and fulfilled his oath, so he was free to stay in Rome.
And the Roman Senate was so disgusted by this cunning attempt to masquerade deceit as prudence that they put the guy in chains and shipped him right back to Hannibal.
Deceit doesn't remove the guilt of perjury, it aggravates it.
He also mentions Titus Manlius. A tribune named Pomponius was aggressively suing Manlius's father and had banished Manlius to the country.
Manlius sneaks into Pomponius' bedroom with a sword, stands over the bed, and threatens to kill the tribune right there unless he swears a sacred oath to drop the lawsuit against his father.
Terrified, the tribune swears the oath.
And out of pure respect for the sanctity of that oath, Pomponius actually dropped the lawsuit.
He saved his own life, yes, but he kept the oath even though it was made under extreme duress to save a man who had treated him poorly. That is how deeply ingrained the concept of good faith was.
When you really delve into the psychology of Regulus, it's just astounding. He advocated against his own release.
He engineered his own demise because he believed what was disadvantageous for the state could not possibly be advantageous for him as an individual citizen.
It is the ultimate, final synthesis of expediency and moral rectitude. He achieved the highest possible good, absolute moral perfection at the cost of his physical life.
Which brings us to the starkest contrast possible. Regulus proves that pain cannot destroy a good man. But what about a philosophy that says pleasure is the highest good?
If pain didn't break Regulus, can pleasure break us?
In chapter 33, Cicero launches a blistering attack on the Epicureans and the Cyrenaics, who argued exactly that.
Right. If you believe that pleasure is the supreme good in life, and pain is the supreme evil, then virtue is just a tool.
It's just a mechanism to help you get more pleasure and avoid pain.
Cicero finds this incredibly degrading to human dignity. If pleasure is the goal, what does wisdom become?
It becomes merely a skillful collector of pleasures. It becomes a sommelier of bodily sensations.
He asks, what place does fortitude or bravery have if your only goal is avoiding pain?
How can you commend temperance and self-control if you posit pleasure as the supreme good? Self-control is the foe of the passions, but the passions are the handmaids of pleasure.
He attacks philosophers like Calophon and Deinomachus, who tried to have it both ways. They tried to yoke pleasure together with moral rectitude, saying you can pursue virtue and bodily pleasure equally.
Cicero says that's like yoking a man with a beast. True moral rectitude abhors that union.
Goodness, generosity, true friendship. They cannot exist if they're only cultivated for personal advantage or sensual pleasure. They have to be sought for themselves or they aren't real.
Here is where Cicero becomes deeply countercultural to us today. We live in an absolute treat-yourself culture, a maximize your personal happiness culture.
We are bombarded with the message that the goal of life is a comfortable, pain-free, pleasurable existence, and that we should use life hacks to acquire it.
Cicero's forcing you to look in a harsh mirror. Are your virtues just tools to get you a comfortable life, or are they the goal themselves?
Are you the master of your desires, doing what is right regardless of the cost, like Regulus? Or are you just a skillful collector of pleasures, trying to avoid discomfort at all costs?
It's a sobering reflection, and as Cicero closes the book, there is a profound narrative shift. He turns his attention directly back to his son, Marcus.
He calls these 3 volumes a generous present from a father. He asks his son to treat these books as fellow guests, keeping him company in Athens.
It's incredibly intimate. He says, "In them my voice will travel to you." He hoped to see him face to face soon, but he couldn't leave Rome because his country called him back with accents unmistakable.
You can feel the weight of history crashing down here. Cicero, sensing his own end, sensing the total collapse of his beloved republic, sending this lifeline of moral absolute truth across the sea to his son.
It is a legacy. It's a demand to live a life of uncompromising integrity in a world that consistently rewards compromise.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to chew on. Something that wasn't explicitly spelled out, but bubbles up from everything we've discussed today.
If Cicero is right, if expediency and moral rectitude are truly one and the same thing, how does that completely change the way we view our own failures?
Think about a time you lost a promotion, or a major business deal fell through, or you lost an election, specifically because you refused to compromise your ethics.
You did the right thing and you lost the prize. Society tells you that you failed.
But perhaps, in Cicero's eyes, those aren't failures at all. Perhaps losing the world to keep your soul isn't a tragedy. It is the absolute highest form of success.
That is the standard Regulus set. And it is the standard Cicero leaves us to grapple with.
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.